Greetings from my second home in Asuncion, Paraguay. I'm going to explain to you why when it comes to man-woman relations, specifically with women, but with men too, you cannot hate without also loving. What? Yes. And I am taking the term love-hate relationship to an extreme and literal level when I talk about this. So a few examples from my past. Many years ago, as many of you know, I got divorced. This is back in 2007. It's an eternity ago. And as I've talked about several times, divorce is never fun, especially when you have children, and I did, and I do. And for a few months, I was sad, and I felt bad, and I felt awful. And this is part of what you go through when you go through a divorce. Or when I say divorce, replace divorce with a long-term cohabiting relationship ends. You don't have to be legally married to, quote, go through a divorce. So if you, those of you, and many of you have, if you are living with a woman for a long time in a monogamous relationship and then she leaves or there's a breakup, that kind of thing. And it's not very fun. And then within a few months, I think in my case it was 3 to 4 months, I was, and I've written many articles about this, I've spoken about this in podcasts and things like this, I was as happy as I had ever been up until that point in my entire life. The level of happiness and joy that surged through my body was amazing. And I remember this happening. This was, 16, 17, 18 years ago now, however long ago. And I remember experiencing this. I was driving around in my car, even though I was living in a little apartment with no furniture, with no bed. I had a little mattress in a corner, going through a divorce. Divorce took about 2 years, and everything's a mess. And this is after several months of pain. I was so happy that I was laughing out loud in my car. I was so full of excitement and joy, just pure moments of joy, because now I was free to do whatever I wanted. And again, this is something a lot of men go through when they go through divorce. And many of you have reported to me the exact same thing. You may have known men who are divorced. They're awful for a while. Once the pain is over, they are the happiest they've ever been in their entire lives, once the pain is over. And for me, this was about a 3 or 4 month process. Now, I am a robot. I am an INTJ. I am not an overly emotional personality type. And so I'm also outcome independent. I'm also a naturally happy person. All these other factors. That was pretty short even as compared to most men. So I think most men when they go through divorce are pissed off or upset or sad or feel bad or whatever you want to use it for a year or two. Matter of fact, my advice to men when they go through divorces is to not date any women, have sex, yes, but not date anyone, no MLTRs, no OLTRs certainly, until it's been a full year after your divorce. Just have FBs and recover mentally. And so I acknowledge that 3 to 4 months is pretty quick for most human beings, including most men. But the dynamic is the same. And maybe for you, if you got divorced or if you ever do get divorced, it will be a year for you or 2 years or whatever, okay? So for me, it took about 3 to 4 months, just that context. And for my former wife, ex-wife, there's a term, ex-wife, former wife, there's a specific terminology of what is a former wife and what is an ex-wife, not sure, but anyway. My wife at the time, who I divorced, it did not take her 3 to 4 months. It took her approximately 5 years. And so for 5 years, she quote unquote hated me and bad-mouthed me to other people, bad-mouthed me to my children, which is very typical and normal for women when they go through a divorce. Women kind of lose their fucking minds and they get really mad and they bad-mouth you. This is, again, part of a divorce. I never bad-mouthed her. Even to this day, you've never heard me bad-mouth my ex-wife, ever. I've stated a few facts and a few negative things, but I've never bad-mouthed her, called her names and said, oh, that bitch. And because most other men who get divorced go through this. Oh, that bitch and that fucking, I should ruin my life, fucking bitch. You've never heard me say this because that's not the way I work. But she badmouthed me for quite a long time, as my kids reported. And so years later, but within 5 years of my divorce, I was, many of you know, dating other women. I've talked about this in podcasts and things like this. And one day I was talking to a woman I was seeing. This was several years after my divorce. And I mentioned this to her. And that I'm like, yeah, I was over everything, 3 or 4 months after the divorce. My ex-wife is still furious about this. She hates me. She regularly talks shit about me and badmouths me to my family and my kids and her family, and And immediately this woman turned to me and said, she still loves you. And at the time I went, huh? What? No, she hates me. She can't stand me. She goes, yeah, and she loves you. I said, what? She goes, right. If she didn't love you, if she doesn't have feelings for you, she would just be like you. She would have moved on. She said, she said to me, Caleb, the reason you moved on so quickly is you no longer, do you still love your ex-wife? I said, well, no. And she said, right, you probably stopped loving her within a few months after the relationship ended, right? I said, yeah. And she said, if she was like that, she wouldn't care about you. She might roll her eyes if someone mentions your name, but that'd be it. She wouldn't be furious about this and angry doing X, Y, and Z. And bad-mouthing, she wouldn't be like this because she wouldn't care. The fact that she hates you, the fact that she's still upset about this means she still has feelings for you. And I thought about this, and it made a lot of sense to me. And I started watching other people's behaviors, men and women both, who had gone through major breakups, long-term relationships, especially cohabiting relationships or divorces. And I saw a similar dynamic. I saw that people, usually it's women, who still liked the guy would hate the guy for years. And people, usually women, who didn't give a shit about the guy would just move on and be perfectly fine. Around this same time, I was dating another woman, and we were getting somewhat serious. I've talked about her before. I forget what name I've used for her because I assign false names to people, women in my past, to connect their anonymity and things like that. And it was a woman I was seeing, and it was a woman I really liked a lot. We were getting really serious. And interestingly, she was, I was in my late 30s at the time. She was in her very early 30s, like 31, something like that, 32, something like that. She had a kid, a daughter, young daughter, around my daughter's age at the time, 8, 9 years old or something like that. And she had been divorced many years prior, like in her early 20s. So she had been divorced, unlike me at the time. She had been divorced for like 10 years or close to it. And interestingly, she still hated her ex-husband. And she would regularly bring this up. And she would regularly have all kinds of drama and problem with her ex-husband when it came dealing with their shared child. He was already married to someone else. And they would have these long, drawn-out arguments over texts. Usually back then it was mostly email. Big, long arguments over email, sometimes spats over the phone. And she would be very upset about this and talk shit about this guy all the time. Uh-oh, and I didn't put this together until years later. As a matter of fact, the way the divorce occurred is that she was married to this guy, they had a kid, he cheated on her with some other person, left this woman, divorced this woman, married her, and had kids with her. And so she sometimes, this woman I was seeing, had to coordinate with this new wife. And her name in this woman's phone, the new wife, was Homewrecker. And she was furious about this woman, even though it had been a decade since their divorce. And as a matter of fact, before I made this distinction about what was going on, I would even ask her about this. I said, your divorce, wasn't your divorce like 9, 10 years ago? Yeah. Well, I mean, why are you still pissed about this? She's like, yeah, I shouldn't be. But she was. And later, as we were getting more and more serious, one day, completely out of the blue, I've written about this, she stopped seeing me. She just vanished. No argument, no problem, no explanation, nothing. She just was gone. And I would text, hey, what's wrong? You want to hang out? And just nothing. Ghosted me. Now, 94% return rate with women, as always. She eventually came back a few years later. They always do. But she just vanished when everything was going great. Why did that happen? Because she still had feelings for her ex, even though it had been many, 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 many years. Had she not had feelings for her ex, she wouldn't have given a shit about this. She would have said, oh God, what a dickhead, and just rolled her eyes and moved on instead of bitching and moaning and complaining all the goddamn time, having tons of drama with this person. She wouldn't have given a shit. So this applies mostly to women, but this can also apply to men. I have known a few men who years after their breakup or divorced are still bitching about their bitch wife or bitch ex-wife or bitch ex-girlfriend or other words they use that I'm not going to use. And they're bitching and moaning and they're pissed off about this woman. Guess what that means? There might be some of you, maybe even you, watching this video. You still have these angry fucking feelings for your ex, even though it's been years. Now, I'm going to say, when I say years, I'm talking about more than 2 years. Under 2 years, you're allowed to be pissed off about your ex, especially if it's a long-term marriage, you have kids together. Okay, I get that. I think that's silly, but I get it. I understand human feelings. I don't have a lot of human feelings, but I understand them. Less than 2 years. But if it's been 3 years, 4 years, in the case of my ex-wife, 5 years, in the case of this woman I dated, 10 years, approximately, and you're still furious at this ex that you had, guess what that means? You still have feelings for this person. And on the flip side, if you are dating any women and it's been more than 2 years and they're still bitching and angry and furious about some ex-boyfriend or ex-husband they had more than 2 years ago, guess what that means? She still has feelings for him. Now, if she's an FB, that's fine. If she's an MLTR, and certainly a candidate for OLTR, that's a red flag. In my world, she shouldn't even qualify. Low-end MLTR, maybe if you have other MLTRs, that might be okay. FB, certainly that's fine. But if you're dating this person, you like this person, guess what that means? One more thing I will throw into this. If you are dating a woman who just recently had a big breakup, not she broke up with her boyfriend, women, especially young women, break up with their boyfriends all the time. That's normal. I'm talking about she was married and or cohabiting with a man for many, many, many years. And the relationship just ended a few months ago. You can have sex with her as an FB. Okay, you can hang out with her, that's fine. But this is not an ideal person to date seriously. Anything above a low-end MLTR, standard MLTR, high-end MLTR, OLTR candidate, OLTR, not a good idea. Very bad idea. This is also why I tell men to not do this when they're right out of a divorce, as I mentioned earlier. So just be aware, if you or anyone you know still is furious about an ex, and it's been more than a year or two, you now know what that means. That person still has feelings for that person. That person hasn't moved on yet. And if that person didn't have any feelings, they wouldn't give a shit, including you. Remember this next time you encounter this from a woman, or if you yourself have these thoughts.